Hello and welcome to today's virtual program, Martial Law Implications of South Korea and the U.S.-Korea Relationship. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the President and CEO of the Korea Society. Last week, South Korea experienced a truly black swan event when President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law, and then the National Assembly members rose to the occasion, gathering in the early morning hours and voting just 6 hours later to unanimously overturn martial law according to lawful and constitutional procedures. President Yoon's future is in question, with investigations swirling and calls for his impeachment continuing. While political conditions and the question of future leadership remain unsettled, from my perspective, the commitment to democracy and constitutional government by the people of Korea is demonstrably settled. The strength of the U.S.-Korea alliance and relationship is rooted in shared democratic values. That hasn't changed. Turning to the economic and financial front, the BOK governor noted in a parliamentary hearing the other day that it would be difficult for the $1 exchange rate to return to levels seen in the past for the time being amid the short-lived martial law imposition. Yet, volatility in the financial and foreign exchange markets will likely prove temporary in view of Korea's robust fundamentals and external stability in the economy, noted Finance Minister Chae Sang-mok. The Ministry of Finance and Economy also noted that the National Assembly passed the national budget, $673 trillion, and that the government will make every effort to swiftly execute the budget in 2025. So in conclusion, negative implications, but they will be limited and short-lived. This is a view expressed by the Korea Development Institute President Cho Dong-chul, and I agree with his assessment. To unpack the short-lived martial law, its immediate aftermath, and delve into what might come next, we are joined remotely by two experts and friends of the Korea Society. Aram Hur is the Kim Koo Chair in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. Her research focuses on nationalism and democracy, with special attention to issues of identity, integration, and democratic support in East Asia. She was selected as the 2021 Sherman Emerging Scholar by the Korea Society. Michelle Ye Hee Lee is the Washington Post Tokyo Bureau Chief on Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Previously, she covered money and influence in politics and voting access on the National Political Enterprise and Accountability Team, and was a reporter for the Post's Fact Checker. Prior to joining the Post in 2014, she was a government accountability reporter at the Arizona Republic newspaper in Phoenix. The Korea Society thanks our corporate sponsors and individual members for their generous support, which has made this program possible. We are welcoming your questions live. Please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. The moderators for today's discussion are Korea Society Policy Director Jonathan Corrado and Policy Program Officer Chelsie Alexandre. The floor is yours, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think you did a great job setting the stage for how this conversation is going to unfold today. Aram, Michelle, good morning and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is such a fast-moving story. There's so much happening so quickly. So in this discussion today, I'm hoping that we can focus on the so what portion of it all. What are the deeper implications for everything that is happening? And we're just now finding out exactly what went down and who was responsible. And those conversations and investigations are going to continue for a long time. But what we want to do is discuss what it means for Korea and for the alliance. Chelsie, good morning. Thank you for joining us on this rainy New York morning.
Morning, Aram. Morning, Michelle.
Michelle and Aram, how are we feeling? Okay, before we dive into the subject matter? Yes, nods of okay, but maybe not as great as we possibly could be. So this isn't primarily a history program, but I do want to briefly review history of martial law in Korea, civil military relations, and democratic stagnation. So Aram, we'll kick it off with you because you've written, along with Andrew Yao, that nationalist polarization causes democratic stagnation in Korea. And I'm particularly interested in this notion of, quote, mutually exclusive nationalist visions. I think this is a really important concept for us to understand exactly how this has unfolded. So can you tell us how is this dynamic that you've discussed, how is it manifested historically?
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Korea Society, for having us this morning. So, the question on everyone's mind, I think, is, why this and why now, right? And the answer that's been given that's out there is that, this has to do with Korea's extreme polarization. But I think that's really only part of the answer. Polarization even at extreme levels exists in democracies elsewhere, but not all of those democracies are having martial law decrees. So what's special about Korea's polarization is that it's actually a very specific form of partisan polarization, which Andrea at Brookings and I have written and called nationalist polarization. So this is when the party factions are divided on the axis of, as you said, mutually exclusive nationalist visions. So the party factions in South Korea are still very much divided along the lines of the Cold War era's nationalist conflict, with the contemporary left espousing kind of what I would describe as a ethno-nationalist one Korea vision that's reunified with North Korea, and the right championing a kind of global Korea vision that sees Korea as aligned and embedded in the US-led liberal international order. And this has a lot to do with the history, right? This is because after the armistice of the Korean War, within South Korea, the primary cleavage was between the ruling Southern faction and any remaining pro-Northern loyalists and communist sympathizers that remained in the South under the parallel, who were then labeled as national dissidents, persecuted, and really began to form the basis of the first political opposition. And it's that opposition that later becomes a core part of South Korea's push for democracy. And once the regime liberalized, the sort of emerging political parties then organized around that primary cleavage and kind of froze around them, around these competing national factions. And so Korea historically is a case of a democracy that was born into and in many ways from the unresolved nationalist conflict from the Korean War and Cold War. Now, to bring that into current day, why does it matter that it's nationalist polarization? Well, nationalist polarization is uniquely detrimental to democracy. And the reason is that nations are inherently state-seeking. So what I mean by that is nations are essentially political communities that seek self-rule through the total and exclusive ownership of their own state. Right. And so when political parties become consumed by these types of nationalist pursuits, it severely distorts the rules of the democratic game. You can imagine the end goal of democratic competition is not representation, but actually state capture. The opposition is no longer a valid competitor to be respected, but an existential threat to be eliminated in trying to protect our nationalist vision. Now, this is going to start to sound quite familiar to what's happening in South Korea. And so nationalist polarization, more so than other forms of polarization, incentivize and sometimes even mandate party elites and members to explicitly violate norms of forbearance and mutual tolerance, these things that are seen as the informal guardrails of a democracy. And so this is all dangerous for democracies at any stage. But like in South Korea, when it's embedded from the very start, it kind of habituates a vicious cycle of illiberal partisan competition and actively impedes democratic norms from really fully solidifying and developing.
Excellent. That's such helpful context. And Michelle, I want to turn to you to kind of discuss how that has actually taken place. So Korea has a long history of leaders declaring martial law, Chun Doo-hwan and Park Chung-hee, but that was a very different context than what we're seeing today. So can you tell us a little bit about why Korea's past authoritarian leaders have used martial law and how it compares to what happened last week?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Good evening from Seoul. I mean, Aram has really covered the big picture here, and a lot of what people have been talking about here in Korea has been, what people experienced during those days, mostly in the 60s and 70s when martial law was fairly common. I believe emergency martial law was declared something like a dozen times, and the vast majority of them were in the 60s and 70s during these military dictatorships where martial law was used to quash political dissenters and to really crack down on the public and keep the public in line during a very developmental dictatorship era. Where I find it really interesting now that even some elderly Koreans recall those days as like a time when martial law was kind of needed to keep the public in line and to actually help grow the Korean economy and focus on the developmental aspect of Korea. Of course, Gwangju uprising has been invoked a lot this past week, when in 1980, after Chun imposed martial law, pro-democracy activists in Gwangju rose up against it, faced a violent crackdown. In response, military forces beating protesters, firing indiscriminately into crowds, something like 200 to 1,000 people who died. This has very much been in the minds of Koreans here. Another thing that has been invoked a lot is the 12/12 incident. It's very fresh on people's minds because of the movie that came out earlier. I think it was about a year ago or maybe late last year. I remember watching it in the theaters and leaving and overhearing a lot of Koreans just using curse words to talk about those days. And it was that that sort of emotional response people were having in 2024.
Can you tell us, just for the people who aren't familiar with the movie, just what's that movie about?
Yeah, well, it was the coup that Chun Doo-hwan had orchestrated, and kind of the inner workings of it, and what led to him trying to take over Seoul that evening of 12/12, which actually is tomorrow here in Seoul.
Wow.
So it's very much in line with this moment and what people are thinking about and watching, and had already been in the public awareness and forefront of their minds even before all of this began. So it's really kind of dredging up all of this history from that era. And Yoon's actions are very much reminiscent of this strongman era. The reasoning for Yoon's martial law initially sounded and looked a little bit similar to claims during that time, attacking his political opponents, blaming pro-North Korean forces, pro-communist forces. And President Yoon Suk Yeol is somebody who very much views his critics as North Korean sympathizers and people who are conspiring against him on behalf of North Korea. This is a rhetoric we've heard from him over and over, and we saw it at play when he initially declared martial law. Of course, it's sort of barely a martial law if you think about it, because it lasted 155 minutes before they voted it down. People have been saying it's shorter than the runtime of the movie Wicked, whereas the longest martial law was something like 456 days.
Wow.
Schools were shut down, people couldn't go to work, there was curfew. It was very different this time. Nonetheless, it very much dredged up that era.
Yeah.
Lastly, I listened to a recording of a father in his probably 50s, 60s, so very familiar with that era, talking with his son in the military, so probably 21, 22.
Yeah.
And it was right after the martial law had been declared, and he said, and he was in tears saying, martial law is very dangerous. Be careful out there. Your priority is your life. Don't shoot citizens, protect yourself, protect your underlings. And it was incredibly emotional for so many people in the moment. People who didn't realize it was going to end in 6 hours, but still, it was very traumatic.
Yeah, and just, recalling those scenes of the citizens who showed up to the National Assembly and, put themselves in between the National Assembly members trying to re-enter the National Assembly to do the vote to end martial law, as is their constitutional right to do so, and clashing with soldiers and police officers. And one episode that I heard about was an older gentleman who had participated in the past in some of these pro-democracy protests, confronting a police officer or a soldier and saying, "Young man, you're on the wrong side of history here." And we do hear some reports of soldiers kind of half-heartedly fulfilling what their orders were, and some confusion about exactly what the orders were, the 707 special forces that were dispatched. Some of them initially thought that this had to do with a terror incident or a pro-North Korea faction, so a little bit of confusion over exactly what was taking place. So I want to get into now the context of how this came to be. So, Michelle, I'll start with you. What do we have to know specifically about President Yoon's tenure up until today that led up to this decision? Because this was a dramatic choice, right? So a big risk, a big gamble that certainly did not pay off.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been covering the Yoon presidency since the beginning, since the election, and Aram mentioned polarization earlier. It's certainly not the only factor that led up to this, but I do believe polarization has a big deal to do with it, because President Yoon came into office with nothing close to a mandate. It was like less than 1% margin, something like 200-some thousand votes. Since then, he's done nothing to actually expand that base. And in fact, if you look at the Yoon presidency, it has been consistently decisions that were divisive with the country. Japan issue, for example, doctor strikes, for example, and really no public messaging to bring the other half along. And this is, even just objectively speaking, and I've interviewed him twice and I've asked him about this. I've asked him, your country is quite divided, for example, on the Japan issue, and you've not done much to try to bring them along. What do you think? And he was very set that this is an issue that he feels strongly about, and he's going to do it no matter what. And he's only going to reach a certain number of people who would agree with him. And that's sort of been his mindset all along. And I think you add that sort of a governing mindset from the top leader to an already polarized country, to a country that then became even more angry with inflation, high rising prices, inflation rising around the world, and certainly here in Korea. If you remember the election earlier this year in April, and how the price of green onions became a flashpoint,
Right.
and people were wearing green onion headbands to polls. I mean, there's a reason why onion prices became such a visceral thing for so many Koreans. So you add on top of that, and then you add on top of that scandals involving his wife, which have already been salacious, but also just has been nonstop weaponized by the left. It's begun with the Christian Dior bag, then it began with her calls with a news blogger about conversations she had, and I believe it was bashing his party earlier in the election season. Then it was the Christian Dior bag, and then most recently it's the Myung-tae-gyun issue, the pollster who appears to have been speaking with the First Lady and possibly with the President. Kakao Talk messages being released. I was in a 2-hour press conference recently with President Yoon, and an hour and 50 minutes of it was about this particular scandal, because the public just really is interested and angry about it, and people wanted him to talk about it. He didn't want to disclose much information. So you add on top of everything that had already existed, then you pour gasoline over the fire that is deep polarization, and you add all these scandals, then you give the left plenty of material to continue calling for his impeachment, continue dividing the country. And I do believe at this point, the president has had it. He feels like he's been backed into a corner, according to his supporters. That's how they're framing it. And he had no other choice, is what his supporters are saying, that he's been isolated, he's been pushed to the brink, and this was his action. He's been sort of devolving into this conspiracy theory of election rigging, involving his party as well. So I think there are so many different factors here, but I do think at the core is this deep polarization that has only been fed to be deeper and deeper and even more polarized.
Excellent, very well put. And we have seen in some of the protests since the martial law, people showing up with green onions, a symbol of that dissatisfaction from the earlier issues. So Aram, I want to turn to you to ask what else we need to know about the state of South Korea's democracy in 2024 that led to this. And also that led to the resilience of ultimately civil society and the opposition were able to counterbalance. But how did we end up in this situation?
So, the why now part of this is curious because this kind of deep nationalist polarization has always existed. It's not actually new in South Korean politics. And I think the answer to that has a lot to do with the sort of unprecedented rise of the left in South Korea. And so this might seem a little bit confusing because the left has won presidencies before, but actually, in fact, it has always been sort of the political underdog in South Korea's domestic politics. And the reason is that the Conservative Party, Yoon's People Power Party, is a legacy party from the days of authoritarian rule when it had total control. So this comes with many advantages in terms of material resources, networks, party brand. And so it has really been the politically and electorally dominant force since democratization. Now, in contrast to the left had a very crippled start. Most of the big businesses and chaebols that had benefited from state-led development during authoritarian rule sided with the right. And there was also the taboo of communism. And because the right sort of claimed the success story of state-led development, the left was essentially edged out of building its own sort of interventionist economic brand. And so for all these reasons, right, the right has always been wary of the left, but could always kind of fall back on the national security law to repress any leftist surges, and really, I think, didn't take the left that seriously. And that all changes in 2016 with the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, which I really see to be this watershed moment. I think the Park's political scandals and corruption charges actually hit a much deeper nerve among the South Korean public in terms of like a growing disillusion with the right's nationalist vision. Pursuing this sort of global Korea entailed, liberalizing the markets after the Asian financial crisis. That meant that, a lot of sectors became vulnerable to global competition and were driven out. And also being, accepting and becoming more comfortable with stronger U.S. influence on the peninsula. And all of these things came with real costs to the ordinary Korean in terms of less social mobility, increased inequality, and this feeling of kind of succumbing to rather than joining the liberal international order. And so in my mind, the millions of protesters that came out with the candlelight movement were, it was in many ways a backlash to the right's kind of tall promises. And all that Park and, her identity as the daughter of Park Chung-hee, all of that legacy that it embodied. And it's against that backdrop that you have the left under Moon Jae-in's administration handily win that snap election in 2017. And again, the left had won presidencies before, but never with this kind of popular mandate and moral high ground against the right. And with this sort of perceived public shift or growing disillusion with the conservative agenda, the left, is for the first time, freer than ever to, I think, openly embrace its competing ethno-nationalist vision of Korea. And so the Moon administration really pursued this with, for on-the-ground observers, like a palpably different tenacity, I have to say, from the 적폐청산 campaign, this uprooting of deep-seated evils, to how he sort of unilaterally and systematically pursued a overtly nationalist agenda of, re-engaging inter-Korea relations with all of the summits with Kim Jong-un, the systematic weakening of Korea-Japan relations, Japan being a country that in the ethno-nationalist imagination of Korea holds sort of a permanent stain due to the colonial experience, all of the trade disputes, if you remember, and whether or not Korea was going to pull out of GSOMIA or not. So all of those things were sort of this a really sort of different level of aggression from the left. The left loses 2022 by a hair, right, due to its own political scandals, but then secures back-to-back majorities in the National Assembly afterwards. And so you have this scenario of the political underdog that has really risen as a dominant player that's now really fighting back. And I think it's to understand this moment, you have to contextualize it with that sort of rapid, concentrated crescendo of the left's power within just a span of 5 years, right? And remember, this is a left that the right sees because of nationalist polarization as kind of an existential threat. And it's that movement, that shift that I think generated this sort of, or at least, built the foundation for this kind of fight or flight response that we saw from Yoon and his party.
Really fascinating. Thank you so much, Aram. And also interesting that the Moon Jae-in presidency ended with an atypically high approval rating. Normally, the approval rating graph for Korean presidents takes a decline towards the end of the term, but for Moon Jae-in, it was rather high. So another element to the surprise of Lee Jae-myung's loss there in the election against Yoon Suk Yeol. Michelle, anything to add there before we move forward?
I think that was great.
Okay. So let's look at the goals and the reactions. And I know that we're not done with sort of the archaeology here of what exactly was Yoon Suk Yeol trying to accomplish with this martial law decree. And of course, there was the national security justification, but that seems like a bit of a pretext, right, for these more domestic political agenda items. But what do we know about what he was going for, and why do you think it failed so quickly? I mean, this was, as you mentioned, just a matter of hours before it was overturned.
Yeah, I mean, I think big picture is that it was an incredibly risky, ill thought out, and miscalculated power play. Although it does seem like it wasn't as spontaneous as initial reports had put it. There were actually speculations that he might declare martial law as early as September from the opposition party, and they had been basically, accusing him of planning martial law with no real proof at that time. The presidential office strongly denied it. They said, "What kind of a democracy do you think we are? Of course, we would never declare martial law." And they just swatted it right down. And when he actually filed the martial law decree, he talked about Democrats obstructing governance by filing the 22 impeachment motions against various senior officials, their budget cut proposals, including, for example, cutting the budget of the unification ministry. And after the, sorry, my cat just, after the martial law, I spoke with a presidential official who was familiar with his thinking, and they did describe it as, the president, he's been a prosecutor. He knows that the National Assembly members were going to come together and vote it down immediately, but he wanted to send the message. He said the president did it overnight so that it minimizes the impact on the national economy and on the people's daily lives. And he sent the military an hour later. So that was sort of like the response that I got. And I In one sense, I think there is something to that, in that if the president were serious about doing a proper martial law that the lawmakers couldn't vote down, why did he do it on a Tuesday night when all the lawmakers were very nearby Yeouido?
Yeah.
Why didn't he do it on a weekend? Why didn't he do it
Yeah.
today when yesterday the session ended? So today's the first day when there is no active session. So
Yeah.
there's that. But then at the same time, now we're getting new information through these hearings that there was a army commander who testified yesterday saying that he was told to drag the lawmakers out so that they couldn't vote it down.
Right.
So it seems like there are these conflicting accounts here. I think that either way, it seems like martial law had been on his mind. That's what's coming out now. There was another testimony saying that Kim Yong-hyun, the disgraced former defense minister now, and President Yoon had conversations about martial law as early as a couple months ago. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to take some time, I think, for us to really figure out exactly what his motivations were. But I think it's clear that he must have had some sort of a different outcomes in his mind, right? He must have known it was risky. He must have known it was going to be a big deal. He may have thought maybe he thought he could successfully stop the lawmakers from actually voting it down in time.
Yeah.
Maybe he thought his party would stand by him. Maybe he thought it was worth it no matter what the ramifications. And now he's putting together his legal team so that if he's impeached, he could defend himself. And the Constitutional Court, he knows, is going to have quite a hard time passing it with only 6 judges. So all of these must have been calculations. But again, at the end of the day, he may have just decided that no matter what, it was worth it to do this because he believed it was the right thing to do. I mean, what we know about President Yoon is that he's stubborn. When he makes up his mind, he makes up his mind. Consequences, not always at the forefront of his mind. So.
Yeah, and to the notion of sending a message, I mean, the police and the military were sent specifically to prevent 150 lawmakers from entering the building, which is required for the vote. So, yeah, that puts that into question a little bit. And then to, how long planned out was this question, which we're still trying to uncover, as you mentioned. It was also recently discovered that the drones that were sent to Pyongyang, which previously the South Korean government had denied that they were responsible for, it has now become clear that that was a South Korean military endorsed, if not carried out, operation. And then there is some testimony recently that that might have been an attempt to goad North Korea somehow, and thereby justify the national security pretext. And we're still not sure if that's actually the case, but that speaks to how far out this was planned, right? So yeah, thanks very much for that context. Aram, so turning to you now for the response to this, and this is somewhat, it can be viewed as inspiring, right? So how did the people and how did the National Assembly respond in the immediate hours after the declaration? I think we could learn a good deal about the resilience of South Korea's civil society and the opposition in sort of rising to the occasion here.
Yeah, so as many people know now, 190 of the 300 members of parliament were able to physically get into the building to do the unanimous majority vote, some including members of, Yoon's own party. And so, that combined with the hundreds of citizens, as soon as they heard the news, they just, ran out, and like this is in the middle of the night for South Korea. And so, for me, watching those images was heartening. And it made me think that, even if the South Korean party elites, remain sort of trapped and bound by these the nationalist spines of history and the origins of their parties, that the South Korean citizenry is very much strong. And if you think about who comprises the South Korean citizenry today, it's increasingly, with generational turnover, comprised of 2 distinct groups in my mind. The first is the born democratic generation. So these are, people probably 40 or so and younger for whom South Korea, in their remembrance, right, has always been democratic.
Mhm.
And they take democracy not only for granted, but as a sort of integral part of what it means to be South Korean today.
Mm.
And then it's their parents' generation, right? Who viscerally remember how costly that path was to get to democracy. These are folks, some of whom, from their parents' generation, remember stories about, brutalities of the war and authoritarian rule. These are the people who have classmates or friends or know of classmates who
Mm.
directly perished or were tortured in those democracy protests, right? And their children are a generation that take immense pride, I think, in South Korea's sort of global status now as a cultural icon. And so for these citizens, I think, the thing that I was thinking when I saw the images pouring out is that democracy is a non-negotiable for them.
Mm.
So I think there is tremendous responsibility in this generation, but also I think opportunity for new cultural producers, intellectual leaders, students of this upcoming generation. And it's that generation that really, I think, holds the key to solving this issue, which is, not an issue that's going to be solved by a single generational turnover, but really sort of a multi-generational project of constructing and coalescing around a new and sort of truly unified nationalist vision for South Korea. What does being South Korea mean today?
Mhm.
With its global status, with its longstanding reputation as, one of the best success stories of democracy past World War II. And I think it's finding that new national narrative or national
Mm.
unity that's going to help break South Korea's democracy free from the nationalist shadows that were really cast by the Cold War and still the technically ongoing Korean War.
And history is alive everywhere, of course, but it seems more alive, or especially alive, in South Korea. So I want to move on to talk about the impeachment and the investigations, because these are all swirling around us right now with some deep questions as to what exactly the status of the Korean presidency is right now and where we're headed to next. So we saw a vote for impeachment over the past weekend fail. Of course, another one teed up for this weekend. And in the meantime, we're not exactly sure, but we've heard that the PPP and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo are sort of in a caretaker arrangement at the moment. Some questions about the status of that, the legal status and otherwise. Michelle, can you help us to understand what are the implications of these impeachment attempts and the investigations? There's many investigations right now about treason for Yoon Suk Yeol and other members of the cabinet, including the defense minister. There's some shocking news about him after he was arrested, attempted to commit suicide, and that did not work. He survived the attempt. So what do we need to know about what's happening right now?
Yeah, I want to quickly add to the great point that Aram mentioned. For about over a year now, there's been a weekly protest for Yoon's impeachment in the middle of Seoul. It basically shuts down all of Seoul, like central Seoul, every Saturday, and it balloons quite big every once in a while, but it's a huge like coalition of left-leaning causes, progressive causes that have been coming together around this issue of impeachment, and it's sort of grown into this like at one point, there was a ginormous protest one weekend. I couldn't even get around by taxi. It was impeachment plus climate change plus Itaewon plus anti-Japan plus. So,
Wow.
like, these causes
Yeah.
had sort of been morphing together under this banner issue of impeachment, which I found very interesting. Somehow, Kim Gun-hee and impeaching Yoon has been like the uniting force for so many different progressive causes. And it might be just the way that Koreans have been protest, like it's a very coalition-driven protest culture. But what I found very interesting in the most recent protests is that you see those regular faces, but then you see like the K-popified young protesters coming out with their K-pop lights,
Right.
very like female young generation coming. It's just like clearly drawing out a different kind of people as well. To your question about impeachment and what to expect next, we do have another impeachment vote on Saturday. The one last weekend failed because they couldn't reach a quorum necessary to even open the ballot box to tally the votes.
Mhm.
The Liberals or the opposition party has said that they will be, quote, calling for his impeachment every Saturday, that the schedule of holding an impeachment vote will be weekly moving forward. So that's not going to end anytime soon. Overall, the state of the government here is quite chaotic. It's quite paralyzed. What the two Hans have done, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and the PPP leader Han Dong-un have done, is try to wrest power from the president and try to take over the day-to-day activities. But at the moment, the constitutionality of that is very much up in the air. The prime minister can only take over once there's a vacancy, and there's clearly a president still in office. And they're going to try to find some loopholes to try to make a case for it. But until that loophole is actually held up, I think it's going to just be this sort of gray area where no one quite knows who's handling foreign policy, who's handling defense,
Mhm.
who's handling the day-to-day. The president is still accepting resignations of his ministers, so he is clearly still doing that as a part of his official duties. He doesn't have a foreign trip coming up immediately, so we haven't been yet able to see who is actually going to handle foreign policy. That
Mhm.
will be push comes to shove, I'm sure. So this current like gray zone vegetative presidency hasn't actually been tested, I believe. So I don't know how long it's going to last. But no matter what, it's clear that President Yoon's days are numbered. He's either going to be forced to resign, which is going to be pretty unlikely, but it could happen at this point. You never know. He's going to keep facing these calls for impeachment. The number of votes for his impeachment this coming weekend so far is higher than last weekend. So
Okay.
far, they need 8 PPP members to defect from their party and join the opposition. So far, publicly, they have confirmed 5, which is more than they had last week.
Okay.
And privately, one of the lawmakers said there are as many as 10 people who are willing to support his impeachment. So you're starting to see sort of like the public dialogue shifting a little more toward impeachment than it was last week. But Korean politics moves so quickly. It's only Wednesday. I
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen on Saturday. But I think the big so what implication here is that, it's an incredibly unprecedented time, and it's something that you can't even expect from Asia's 4th largest economy, the world's possibly 10th largest economy, to not know exactly who's running the country,
Yeah.
and to have this continued turmoil that we are all expecting to last for the next several months. So I think the big picture, so what, is that it's just an incredibly unstable time that won't end anytime soon.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And Aram, now looking at after this series of weeks or months or however long it takes to play out, what could come next? I think the hesitation on the part of the PPP and the maneuvering is very much to grab an advantage in shaping that post-fallout, that post-Yoon political space in South Korea. So where do you see things going? I saw a recent poll that puts Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the Democratic Party, the opposition, in favor to win a presidential election. But as Michelle just mentioned, things move very quickly in South Korean politics. And I'll just mention that one of the interesting things about Lee Jae-myung is that some of the policies that he's voiced support for are kind of in alignment with what the future Trump administration would like to do, which would not be the case with Yoon Suk Yeol. And Lee Jae-myung has even referred to himself. He said, "Some people call me the Korean Trump." So all interesting aspects of this. But Aram, what are you thinking?
So I think I think, as per Michelle's point, I think South Korean domestic politics is so fast moving and there are so many black swans that sometimes come up that I think it's a little bit too early to definitively say how this is going to play out. I do think that, the conservatives face a pretty tall barrier given that the martial law decree just hits right at the center of their complicated legacy in South Korea as the authoritarian successor party. So I think, that poses a strong barrier, but I think it's, again, too early to predict, which party is going to assume leadership after this episode is over. So I'm going to tailor my response to your question under the assumption that, let's say, the Democratic Party comes in under Lee Jae-myung's leadership. Like, what would that world look like for South Korea and its global relations? And I think that it's very easy for many people, especially those who don't really know the nitty-gritty of South Korean politics, to think, well, this is the party of the former pro-democracy activists. And so, all else equal, I mean, this should be a gigantic boon for South Korea's democracy. It should be actually seen as this big triumph for South Korean democracy. If that happens, the left will come in, they're going to pursue typically liberal policies like, stronger human rights protection, more sort of engagement and cooperation with regional countries, stronger democratic alliance that fits sort of the US's more value-oriented diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And these are all good things for the stability of democracy in the Asia region. And my response to that is that I think it's so important to temper that optimism with continued vigilance. And the primary reason is that the left in South Korea they are not like political liberals or leftist parties elsewhere. So, going back to sort of the small history bit that I started this session with, right? You have to remember that the core of today's left in South Korea is descended from the pro-Northern faction and communist loyalists that, that remained south of the parallel after the Korean War. These were groups that were labeled by the authoritarian regime as national dissidents. That regime, of course, is now reincarnated today to South Korea's conservatives. And these were groups that were brutally persecuted during authoritarian rule. And they become the core leadership of the pro-democracy movement, not for democracy per se, but because democracy was an incredibly powerful means to actually re-enter the political power game, to give them a chance to capture the state, right? And so, so for the South Korean left, as with the South Korean right, this is a problem that runs through both parties. Nationalism trumps any dedication or commitment to liberal values. And so this idea that, that as long as the, impeachment goes through and that, as long as there's partisan turnover, that everything will be okay in South Korean politics, that this is just sort of a blip or aberration in South Korea's otherwise strong democratic record, I think is a little bit too simplistic of a narrative. So my expectation, if Lee Jae-myung comes into power, is that he's going to fully embrace the characteristically nationalist policies of the left. So this means that, foreign policy-wise, re-engagement with North Korea. As many of us know, North Korea officially abandoned reunification as one of its policy goals for the first time. I think that's going to warm up again. The South Korean left is also going to be heavily pro-China, and this again dates back to the China-North Korea relationship from the Cold War. This comes with probably increased hostility to Japan and sort of a shakeup of the U.S. Korea-Japan trilateral that Yoon's administration has worked very hard to build. And it also means increased wariness of the U.S.-Korea alliance, right? The left has always seen, wanted to see Korea as this sort of self-reliant nation that was free from foreign influence and sort of a redemption from its colonial past. And so has always been sort of doubtful and wary of the U.S. Korea alliance. I mean, that works very nicely to be, as you said, consistent with Trump's goals of pulling U.S. troops out of South Korea, which can have much longer destabilizing security effects on the peninsula. Domestically, the left is typically the party that is harsher on the human rights of North Korean refugees, because these defectors represent sort of a thorn in the side for the North Korean regime. It's probably going to give, I would say, selective fair weather support to minority groups and migrant issues. We've seen this flip-flop many times on both party sides. And, I think we can expect continued retribution cycles against, conservative leaders, a flurry of, I think, prosecutions, just as the right has done to the left as well before, with every partisan turnover. So, in all, I think this idea that democracy will be restored with partisan turnover after this episode, I think is again a too simplistic and perhaps even inaccurate portrayal of what party politics actually looks like and what moves party politics in South Korea.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And now let's go on to the foreign relations piece, and maybe we could push this kind of all together to look at South Korea's foreign relations through the lens of its relationship with the United States. So, of course, questions over who is the commander-in-chief right now are incredibly troubling for the U.S. Korea alliance and vigilance against possible provocations by North Korea. We haven't seen anything thus far, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has said that there's been nothing cited thus far, and the U.S. and South Korea's militaries are working actively to monitor that situation. North Korea was even silent on the matter up until yesterday. It released its first publication on KCNA and Nodong Shinmun, criticizing Yoon. And perhaps the rationale for North Korea's reluctance to engage in a provocation would be to avoid adding any justification to President Yoon's national security justification for the martial law. But looking forward at South Korea's relationship with the United States, what does all this mean, and where do we see things going?
I think that is, I think it's a little bit of a hard question to answer right now as well. I mean, first of all, it's clear the U.S. was caught off guard. And they weren't happy about it. Kirk Campbell talked about it, Jake Sullivan talked about it. They were not happy with the way it went down, which in Diplo speak was quite, stern in the way that they had put it. But I think it's also, we have to consider the U.S. side of it all as well, which is that we're in the middle of a transition. President Trump is coming in, and he doesn't care as much about these diplomatic norms as Kirk Campbell and Jake Sullivan do. And he's bringing a whole new team in. And, I think the Biden administration is very much focused on locking in as many foreign policy wins as they can before they leave office, and trying to square away a lot of other aspects. And clearly this is kind of gonna be all up in the air by the time they leave, and they must realize that at this point. And now we have the news in Syria that's probably going to be dominating the news in DC for a while, and possibly the rest of Biden's term. I think from South Korea's perspective, they're losing a lot of precious time that they could be building good early relations with the Trump team. There were reports of, President Yoon refreshing his golf game, and he and his team trying to figure out how to reconnect or connect with the people that they had been building relationships with on the Trump team. But at the moment, all of that has come to a halt, and right now is sort of the best time to make those moves. And so many countries are already doing that, and Korea is already they're clearly behind. So I think, we've already seen the nuclear consultative group meeting stop. Trilateral, as Aram mentioned, I think is basically going to be at a standstill. President Yoon was always the one sort of moving things along with Japan, but we're just not going to see a future there. The Japanese, the new Prime Minister Ishiba is a supporter of rapprochement with Korea, but at this point, they already see the writing on the wall that there might be a new South Korean president in a few months, and it's never been really in their interest to try to move it forward, and it hadn't been their priority, so it's probably just going to stall at that point, which then raises the question of what happens to President Biden's banner foreign policy success, which was going to be the trilateral re-engagement and trilateral Camp David. It was going to be one of the defining foreign policy legacies in the positive sense for him, and now it's sort of like going to be sputtering along and probably coming to a halt in the matter of months. I think the U.S. side must realize that they're likely going to be dealing with the new liberal president as early as February, as late as August, depending on how the next few months go. And the implications of that, I think Aram has made it clear. It's going to change so much on the foreign policy sense, from everywhere from the U.S. ROK Alliance to trilateral to even, I think, South Korean support for Ukraine. I think that will also be in question. Definitely South Korea's attitude toward China. I think it's all back up in the air now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I want to go to questions now because we got a lot of questions from our audience members. So I hope we could just go a couple minutes over time because I do want to get to those audience questions. So to do that, I'm turning over to Chelsie Alexandre to handle that.
Yes, well, first off, thank you both so much for this conversation. I think we covered a few questions concerning our audience, including kind of what the domestic fallout of this will be and also how North Korea has responded as well. But I was wondering, to the extent possible, whether either of you can kind of zoom out and talk about whether this declaration of martial law was illegal. I think our audience is curious about Yoon even doing this, declaring this. Is this illegal? How does that affect the impeachment proceedings? And if it was illegal, if you could speak a bit to why he did what he did without kind of going through the proper steps.
Well, I think why he did what he did without going through proper steps is really in President Yoon's mind, and I would never venture to guess that. But the constitutionality of his action is really a central issue now because you should be declaring martial law in time of war. And it is clearly not time of war in this moment. And so that's sort of become the central point of the insurrection charges, the illegality of the martial law declaration. It's very much at the core of the Democrats' charge that this was an unconstitutional act and an unconstitutional act of insurrection against his own government. And so that's their argument. So I do believe that the legality of his action to begin with is still in question and something that the opposition is trying to push.
Aram, anything to add there?
No, not much to add. It's just that, the issue is that technically the Korean Peninsula is still at war, right? Even though there's not an active war waging going on because the war ended in armistice, and because South Korea still has an intact national security law that stems from that armistice. I think that's sort of the central problem here of the fungibility of those constraints when it comes to justifying martial law.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to Jung-Ho Roh from Columbia Law School for that question. We have a question from Deborah Nam Crane, and I think this is on a lot of people's minds in the immediate aftermath as to whether or to what extent we can see this initial attempt as a dress rehearsal for some future martial law declaration. Should we be concerned about that? And open to anyone to answer that question.
I can take this question or start. You know, it's it's a quite provocative question, and I do not think that this is sort of a dress rehearsal for a sort of second martial law. I think the international kind of response, and also the response that we saw from South Korean citizens, was incredibly powerful to say, hey, this crosses the line. Having said that, I do think that it kind of sets another degree of precedent, in this ongoing kind of vicious cycle between the parties of, sort of the parallel that I might draw is, with diabetes, like once your blood pressure goes over a certain point, like then you're kind of forever at risk, of it going over that point, that threshold again. And I think the martial law decree kind of did definitely push that threshold of what is within, viable, even imaginable tactics, in order to eliminate the other side. And so I think this is, I really see this as a symptom of a long-standing weakness in South Korean politics, but it definitely, with Yoon's decision, I think we've pushed the envelope, and I do worry that this has expanded that sort of arsenal, and expanded the elasticity of what is considered as a liberal tactics of partisan competition. And in that sense, I think not necessarily a dress rehearsal, but definitely, a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, I think that's a really elegant and smart way to put it. I think if the PPP fails to really rally around this and condemn it widely, that will only embolden it as a potential tactic. That's a party essentially condoning martial law as an act that a president can get away with as long as they're from their party. It becomes a political decision that the party is willing to put up with. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent to set. For what it's worth, the president has said he wouldn't invoke another martial law. I think it is very significant that the top acting defense minister and the Joint Chiefs of Staff have all said they're not going to follow orders from the president if in the case of a new martial law. I think that's incredibly significant that they've gone on the record to say that. The fact that the military has said that, I think, draws a red line, a very clear red line. We'll just have to see now what the political red line is going to be to know how long of a impact this is going to have.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I think I will finish with this final question from Rachel Lorenz at the Creative Contessa, especially given the conversation we had earlier about the nature of South Korea's democracy and how it's come to be. Do you think that Korea's democratic institutions are robust enough to resist party politics? And if so, how do we see that happening? What checks and balances are in place to ensure that the democratic institutions remain strong?
Why don't you finish us off here?
So I think what we've seen, not just from South Korea, but the handful of very prominent cases of backsliding of mature advanced democracies across the world, is that institutions alone are actually not sufficient. Checks and balances can be bended with personal appointments or stacking the deck of who sits on those checks and balance institutions. Agencies that are meant to oversee media neutrality can also be bended by, and so this goes back to, what we see as sort of the informal guardrails of democracy. This is, argument by Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt at Harvard of mutual tolerance and forbearance, that these norms help to guide people who use these institutions, the elites that use these institutions, to use them in the way that it was supposed to be, which was to safeguard the potential for a viable, legitimate opposition. Without that, nothing really separates a democracy from a non-democracy, and even a non-democracy that holds elections. And that's what's really at stake here, I think, with this episode is we're seeing sort of that vulnerability really increase and the space for a viable opposition systematically narrow. Now, the one democratic institution that I think is still, working so well in South Korea is the free and fair elections. And so again, I think this is probably a good endpoint for our session is, the power of the people to see clearly through the fray and really to think of themselves as Democrats with a small d first before partisans. And in a sense, nationalists with a small n. Nationalists in the sense of, what is actually best for Korea? Forget the Cold War conflict that all of this is based on. That has very little resonance to the younger generation in South Korea today. To be nationalists with a small n before partisans, I think those two things are going to be key, and to vote based on that at the ballot box is going to be key for whether South Korea can emerge from this as an even stronger democracy.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to our audience members who submitted questions and are engaging with the sessions. I'll turn it over to Jonathan to close this out.
All right, I'll bring us on home. Thanks everyone for watching today. A huge amount of interest, 350 people signed up, and I'm sure more will watch us on YouTube. And that's a testament to the attractive power of our stars, Michelle and Aram. So thank you so much to you for offering your expertise and insights, which are greatly valuable. Thanks to my co-moderator, Chelsie, Tom Byrne, Peter, and Bradley, who put this all together from a technical point of view. If you are in need of hope, which I think a few of us are right now, you could check out our Hungnam Rescue Program, which is about the largest wartime evacuation of refugees in history. 100,000 people saved during the Korean War. And we had Burley Smith, who is the last surviving crew member of the Meredith Victory, that ship that took the greatest number of refugees out of the port of Hungnam during that episode as they were being encircled and surrounded by Chinese troops. So inspiring story, wonderful to watch. If you need a little bit of hope, check that out on our YouTube page. And other than that, wishing everyone a very happy holiday season. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you back here at the Korea Society soon.
Thank you.